The Pact is a 2018 Spanish psychological horror film that takes as its core premise quite a familiar moral dilemma. Would you be willing to do something terrible in order to save the life of somebody that you loved? Our lead character, Monica, is a mother plagued by nightmares of losing her daughter. When her daughter goes missing one day, Monica fears the worst, and when she eventually does turn up later on, she's slipped into a severe diabetic coma from which she's got a 1 in a million chance of ever waking up from. It turns out, though, that her daughter's condition isn't quite as straightforward as it seems. We learn that the young boy responsible for her state had in fact made a deal to save the life of his mother. As the boy is held and questioned by the police, he suddenly and mysteriously dies. Monica seizes the opportunity, and remembering something that the boy said to her just before he died, she tracks down a lead to the man responsible for making the deal with him in the first place, in the hopes that he too might offer her a last chance to save her daughter's life. Monica meets a sinister dude known as the Albino Spider, and he strikes up a deal with her. In order to save her daughter's life, Monica must first take somebody else's. Now, that's a pretty solid foundation for a film. It's a good central plot. It gives you a decent angsty moral dilemma to play out, and the Pact, I think, does a nice job of examining the lengths that we'd be willing to go to in order to protect our loved ones. The director of this film, David Victori, made this as his feature film debut, which I think is actually pretty impressive, and to date it is still his only significant work in the horror genre, which is kind of unfortunate, because it's the kind of film that has really been made by somebody who's got a real kind of flair for bringing this sort of stuff to life. It's really atmospheric. There's a very kind of appropriately gloomy, doom-laden atmosphere all the way through, with this kind of constant, portentous rumbling thunder in the background, or your night scenes that are always punctuated by these very dramatic flashes of lightning and kind of ominous, stormy downpours. There's some great visual flourishes. I think the recurrent spider motif that you get all the way through is used very well to suggest the kind of creeping, closing in of sinister forces in Monica's life. There's a really beautiful, just heart-stopping trick with an unstoppable hourglass that's one of, I think, the film's very best moments, and just generally a great use of very striking visual representations of encroaching death and doom that show that this is not a film that's afraid to really kind of commit to its horror stuff, and the fantastical elements of the story are very much exploited to their fullest without compromising the essential emotional reality of the characters' plights beneath. The lore that you get in this, the mythology, are really interesting and well worked out. The storytelling too, I think, is just really nice and clear and concise. The setup is swift and efficient. There's a really memorable little opening sequence that introduces the core ideas in an interesting and dramatic way before we then get introduced to our main characters, and all the way through, even though the Faustian Pact story is far from being original, we always know exactly what's at stake. You always know where the characters are emotionally, you always know what they need to do and what the rules of this world are. It's a very nice, succinct, uncluttered story that flows smoothly from one moral dilemma to the next, without getting bogged down in just soap opera, empty set pieces for their own sake, or extraneous, unnecessary B-plots. And I think one of the most impressive things about The Pact is just how much the whole film rests on its lead actress, Belen Rueda. We follow her character Monica for the majority of the film's runtime, and she does just a really good job of being this empathic, human presence that's at the centre of this whole story, as we see her wrestle with her morality and her sense of duty towards her daughter. Belen Rueda is great in this film, and that's perhaps no big surprise. Though she has acted in all sorts of well-known Spanish films and TV series, she's also a little bit of a legitimate horror icon, having starred in films like The Orphanage, Julia's Eyes, The Body, You Shall Not Sleep, and more recently, Phenomena, which was a film that I really enjoyed. The Pact is yet another just really solid turn from Belen Rueda, proving that she really is smart when it comes to choosing her projects, especially amongst the horror stuff that she's been in that I've seen, and she has yet to let me down. So, generally speaking, I really liked The Pact. It's a solid, serious-minded supernatural thriller about wrestling with big moral dilemmas. Those stories are always interesting. In fact, I've only really got one big problem with The Pact overall, and unfortunately, well, actually, now that I think about it, I've perhaps got maybe two big problems. The first is maybe a little bit less important, but it's the daughter. I just can't stand the daughter in this film. She spends the first half hour just being the most moany, obnoxious twat. She's got one of those just miserable, sullen, mopey faces that you just want to slap. And that, I think, is maybe a little bit of an issue, because fair enough, you can say that the daughter is basically just a plot device. But for this film to work, we really need to feel what Monica feels. We need to believe that she really loves her and that she'd be willing to do anything to save her daughter. And because she's just such a fanny, you just kind of find yourself thinking, you know, you'd probably be better off just leaving her in the coma. But really, that's just me. Honestly, the big problem with The Pact, the reason that's a film I really like and not one that I love, is to do with, and this is maybe the worst thing that you can say about any film in terms of putting somebody off, but it's the ending. Without spoiling things, let's just say, there's a particular way that films like this tend to go. There's a particular end point that stories about making Faustian pacts with the devil almost always end. There's a lesson you come away with at the end of that particular age-old story, and having your characters reach that end point is often what the telling of that story is all about. The problem is that The Pact has got a really bad case of, it's got a really good ending, okay, it builds up this big dramatic climax, all of its characters come to a head and have to face the consequences of their actions thus far, and it's emotional, it's powerful, you're really invested in what's happening, it pretty much does in fact what you expect it to, but then it just kind of goes, yeah, but, at the end of that, and it adds in this little twist at the end that completely changes what the entire film's been about. And by the ending, I mean pretty much just like the last 45 seconds, really just that little tiny coda at the very end that actually makes all the difference. And sadly, it completely changes what sort of a story this film ultimately is. It just suffers really badly from having an ending that tries to have its cake and eat it. And it just kind of leaves you thinking, oh, come on.
What kind of ending is that?
It's a twist.
It's a piece of shit.
But even though it does leave you feeling a little bit cheated by the end in terms of having a satisfying emotional through line, I think The Pact is still definitely more than worth a watch for this high-stakes human drama about a mother's love for her daughter. It's full of very kind of atmospheric, stylish supernatural flourishes that bring new life to a familiar concept, as well as this really great central performance from the ever-amazing Belen Rueda. Honestly, the more of her stuff I see, the more and more I like her as an actress. For me, I think The Pact overall is a 7.5 out of 10. It's definitely, I think, one of the strongest Spanish films of the past decade. I think David Victori, the director, should absolutely try and make more horror films in the future, because he's really proven himself with this film to be somebody that can just do really very interesting things in the genre, and honestly, we always need more of those kind of people. So, for those of you who like to stick around until after the credits have rolled, I have another bonus review for you. Just some quick thoughts on a film that I've watched lately that I'd like to share for those of you who are gluttons for punishment. So today's bonus review is a little bit of an odd one. It's another Spanish film which, from what I can tell, made the rounds at festivals in 2012, but didn't actually get picked up for distribution until almost 10 years down the line. Now, chances are maybe I've got that completely wrong, but there really just isn't a lot of information about this particular film out there, which is a low-budget Spanish giallo that goes by the name of Good Night, Said Miss Bird. See, long, flowery poetic title with an animal in it. That is Giallo 101. So you've got your very familiar kind of point of view, young child witnesses horrific event and ends up scarred for life kind of opening scene. You've got your black glove slashings, of course. You've got a fair amount of sex and gore, a killer with a whole host of psychological hang-ups, and you've got some pretty cool Italian-sounding music. The plot is fairly straightforward. Women get sent incriminating photographs, then end up getting murdered. And of course, there's a police investigation undertaken by some very unconvincing looking police who figure out that a young actress named Sonia is all set to be our killer's next victim. It's all familiar enough giallo territory. I guess the main issue with this film is that it does look and feel very cheap. Now, personally speaking, I don't really have a problem with tiny zero-budget films. I think it's just a matter of really adjusting to that particular aesthetic. And I think that even when you can see that very little money has been spent on a film, you can still pick out things that are done well within the particular weight category of a low-budget effort. I think that this is a film that does do well with its budget. There's some decent shots, I think the acting is fairly solid all the way through, and the music is really trying to give this film a sense of being bigger and grander than it really is. The thing is that you see so many low to zero budget slasher films. The horror genre is full of just friends knocking together 80s influenced slashers or DIY zombie or gore films. But it's very rare to see a no budget giallo. It's a lot more of a challenging type of film because the iconography of those films are all based on that very particular kind of lavish, sensual, over-designed 1970s Euro horror style that's really quite hard to conjure up on just pocket change. Obviously, you've got somebody like Luciano Onetti who's just done magical things in capturing that particular look and feel with his films like Francesca or Sonno Profondo, which were both films that were similarly low budget, but managed to look absolutely flawless. Good Night, Said Miss Bird can never quite overcome its budgetary limitations in order to pull off the full giallo aesthetic quite effectively enough, but at the same time, I suppose you have to applaud the ambition of a director that's actually trying something different and not just making another low-effort slasher film. I think the things that you could complain about much more legitimately with this film are that it's got an unbelievably twisty plot that gets wound up in itself way more than it really needs to, even by giallo standards, including at least 4 separate instances where people turn out to be revealed as killers.
4? That's insane.
And my biggest bugbear, it's got one of those and then it just suddenly ends endings, which is a pretty shoddy payoff to a film that runs over 100 minutes, which, of course goes without saying, is a good bit longer than it really needed to be. Now, the director of this film, Cesar del Alamo, has made other films since this, a few other kind of low-budget efforts. But I think from what I've seen, his best genre work has been the screenplay for this kinky little psychosexual head-trip film called Killing Time that came out, I think, last year or maybe the year before, which was actually a really solid, entertaining, smart little film. Now, I don't know if this film really did just sit on a shelf picking up dust for the better part of 10 years, but if it did, then I think that's kind of a shame. It's absolutely not perfect by any means, of course. It's not going to end up on any of my top 10 Spanish horror films lists. But it is a reasonable enough little Giallo homage that doesn't tie itself up in knots copying just the surface stuff, like I think so many modern filmmakers do, but actually just concentrates on telling its own little story. For me, I was probably at, I think, a 5 out of 10 in terms of a rating, just completely average, until that ending dropped. And because it's a film that doesn't really have any kind of an ending, I'm probably going to have to lower that rating to a 4.5 out of 10. And maybe this is just me, right, but I could not get out of my head this whole film just how much the lead actress in this looks like Victoria from Emmerdale.
What?
Or maybe that is just me.